Welcome to the Monagabay newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's frontline, filling in for your regular host, Mike Gaurecki. This week, I spoke with freelance wildlife photographer Marcus Westberg, a two-time Wildlife Photographer of the Year finalist, a fellow at the International League of Conservation Photographers, and a Sony Imaging ambassador. His work has appeared numerous times in outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, Wanderlust, and Vagabond. We talk about conservation philanthropy and his work with notable conservation NGO African Parks, which has benefited from a conservation funding campaign called Prints for Wildlife. This collaborative photography-based initiative has raised $1.75 million for African parks by selling over 15,000 unique wildlife prints since 2020. The latest campaign runs from August 28th through September 25th. Links are provided in the show notes should you be interested in purchasing a print. For some context, previously on the Monagabay newscast, we interviewed Susie Esterhaus on episode 93, who spoke about the complicated but imperative aspects of ethics in wildlife photography. Marcus and I spoke about these ethical practices and the importance of not just patience when working in the field, but also kindness. He joined me from the field where he is currently working in the private wildlife reserve, Svalu, in northern South Africa. So, hi Marcus, welcome to the Monagabay newscast.
Hey Mike, thanks. Nice to be here.
So, first off, where are you now, and what did you see out there today? Is there anything exciting that happened that you'd like to share with us?
I am in Svalu, which is a private reserve in what's known as the Green Kalahari. So it's part of the Kalahari Desert in the northern part of South Africa. But it is, as the name suggests, a very green part of the desert, especially at the moment. This morning I was photographing lions, very, very close to the car. And this afternoon, meerkats. So this is quite a unique ecosystem. So we've got meerkats and pangolins and aardvarks and aardwolves and brown hyenas. So it's a special place to be.
And can you just give us a bit of background on your career in wildlife photography? What do you do in your current role at African Parks?
So I'm a freelance photographer and writer. I do conservation photojournalism as well as travel writing. And so I freelance for African Parks as well. I had my first assignment with African Parks about 6 years ago. So 10, 11 years ago, I was conducting a research project for my thesis in Kenya. And that's when I got into wildlife photography and decided to change paths from academia to essentially writing about and documenting the work that other people are doing and the projects and the issues that the natural world is facing, particularly in Africa, though not only here. And so for African Parks, I generally document quite remote, inaccessible parks in Central Africa. So Republic of Congo, DRC, Central African Republic, Chad. And a few weeks ago, I was in Malawi for the translocation of 250 elephants between two different national parks, so on behalf of African Parks. And I generally do things like this for them, for other NGOs, and then I work on assignment for numerous publications around the world.
So I understand you're one of the photographers that's launching a conservation funding campaign on August 28th called Prints for Wildlife. Can you share with our listeners what this campaign aims to do?
Sure. So this is the third year that this campaign is running. It is a collaborative effort between over 100 wildlife photographers from around the world to raise money for African parks. So many of the photographers involved, their prints would normally be fairly expensive if you wanted to buy a copy. In this case, all the prints are being sold for $100 each in limited editions. In past years of 100, I imagine it'll be the same thing now. And the money, after handling and printing, goes directly to African Parks to support their conservation efforts. And African Parks, for those who don't know, is a very large non-profit conservation organization that manages or co-manages protected areas around Africa. Currently 20, I believe. The goal is to have 30 protected areas under their management by 2030.
Can you share some of your thoughts on conservation philanthropy in general? Obviously, big grants are what gets the news stories. Monagabay published a feature last year about how African parks received a $100 million funding commitment. But what about individuals' conservation funding? How important is that grassroots support?
I think at this point, it's essentially all hands on deck. In several different ways. I mean, the money, of course, sure. We're through Prince for Wildlife. In the first 2 years, we raised about $1.75 million, which is not insignificant, though it's not $100 million. So the money counts. The money is important, but I think almost more important is the awareness that can be raised through campaigns like this, and the fact that people feel as though they are contributing, because they are. But it's not just the financial contribution itself. I think it's the feeling of being involved in something and being a part of something, and that might encourage one to think about questions like this in other scenarios as well. Perhaps even small things like think about recycling more, or use fewer single-use plastic and paper products, things like that. So I think it really does matter.
How common or unique is it for photographers to come together to help fund conservation efforts like this?
It is thankfully something that is becoming more common. A few years ago, I would have said that it wasn't common at all. I mean, you have to remember that all of these photographers who are contributing prints to this campaign for free are normally essentially competitors with one another. I mean, most of us are freelancers. Most of us sell prints on our own websites. So having over 100 photographers come together like this, collaborating on a conservation project, is really, really encouraging, because I think as much as we might like to believe that I as a photographer, as an individual, can make a difference, the truth is that working together we are far, far more effective, and we have a much stronger voice than we do as individuals.
And what are some of the most pressing conservation challenges in your eyes? And what is one of your favorite conservation successes?
We clearly face a number of very, very significant challenges around the world, from climate change to poverty and environmental destruction of different kinds. What I tend to be most involved with is human-wildlife conflict, usually as a result of habitat destruction. And that's certainly something that happens all over the world. In some parts of the world, such as where I'm from in Europe, it's progressed to such a large extent that we hardly think about it anymore. We don't necessarily have that many wild places left. Here in various parts of Africa, that's not quite the case yet. But the human population is growing. Poverty alleviation is incredibly important, and at the same time, this is probably the part of the world with the most fantastic megafauna, so large animals and intact ecosystems around, and that's something that is that we risk losing very, very quickly, and yet we are seeing incredible success stories around the world, but certainly here. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy working with African parks so much. As I mentioned, a few weeks ago, I was in Malawi for an elephant translocation. So part of the reason that animals might be translocated, in other words, moved from one area to another, can be that there are too many in where they are to begin with. And so there might be conflict with people. But there is a more positive aspect of this, and that is that areas where elephants or rhinos or lions or whatever species we might be talking about have existed in the past, but then disappeared through pressure from humans, through hunting, can be brought back to when the areas are considered safe enough. And so for me, the idea that we are now repopulating parts of the world, parts of Africa, with wildlife species that previously were there but have disappeared is fantastic. It really is amazing news.
So bringing the conversation back to wildlife photography, let's get into the ethics of it. It's a topic we've covered previously on the newscast in episodes like number 93 in 2020 when we spoke with Susie Esterhaus. But what is ethical wildlife photography all about for you? To
be honest, I think you can step back from photography when you talk about things like this and just see it as on a much broader scale. I mean, for me, it's about being kind and compassionate. Now, that's not something that is applied only to photography. It's not something that would be applied only to animals or only to people, but all around. But I really think it is that simple. As a photographer, it can be easy to get carried away by the moment and to put yourself and the pictures that you are hoping to take ahead of the well-being of animals, or for that matter, the experience of other people who might be there with you. And I think if you can put a lid on that, if you can keep reminding yourself that that is of secondary importance, no matter how important it might be to you or it might feel to you, to how you behave, how you treat those around you, whether that is a lion, whether it's a habitat, an ecosystem, whether it's insects, whether it's a fellow photographer, then I think you're on the right track. And as I said, that it is sometimes easy for people to get carried away when they are witnessing something that they have dreamt of seeing for years, and they want to come home with fantastic images, but it's simply not worth the price of placing someone else in an unenviable position.
And have you ever encountered ethical dilemmas in the field? And if so, how did you handle them?
I think any photographer who claims to have never faced any ethical dilemmas in the field is probably not being honest with themselves at the very least. For me, because I was introduced to wildlife photography in the Masai Mara in Kenya, my introduction to unethical behavior, not necessarily just photography, but behavior around wildlife, was a very, very stark one, and that left a lasting scar, I would almost say. So for those who don't know, in Kenya's Masai Mara, every year a very large population of wildebeest in particular arrive from the Serengeti, and they cross the Mara River. And this is an incredible wildlife spectacle, but it is also one that gets abused a lot. And it was not uncommon to see 50, 60 cars crowding in at one crossing, blocking the paths for the animals trying to get out of the river, many of whom drown when they try to turn back around again. And so, of course, I've come across situations myself where I catch myself needing to take a step back, reminding myself of what I should or shouldn't be doing. But I think because my introduction was quite harsh in that sense, I took a very deliberate step back even before I was getting into photography properly myself. I only went to 2 river crossings despite living in the Masai Mara for an entire season because it just, what I saw sickened me.
Can you explain why unethical photography can harm not just animals, but also conservation efforts?
I think scale is the big issue here, which is not to say that behavior by a single person at a single time is acceptable or excusable if it places a wild animal in danger or in discomfort. But with the explosion of digital photography, of travel, and of social media, clearly the fact that the same kind of behavior that might not have caused lasting damage if it was done by one person once a year, all of a sudden you've got thousands, tens of thousands of people seeing this online, wanting to take the same photo, wanting to experience the same thing. And at that level, at that scale, you are potentially causing damage on a population level and on an ecosystem level. And clearly that can be harmful in and of itself. But tourism is also such an essential part of conservation, particularly here in Africa. And so anything that compromises that role, that risks turning it into something that causes damage to conservation efforts, to the wildlife populations that you are supposedly there to protect, is clearly an issue. Because without tourism, a lot of protected areas in Africa would not be here. You need income for local people. You need to be able to provide jobs. You need to provide value, economic value, for what are often fairly impoverished populations of people living in these areas. And so anything that compromises that, anything that risks that is really a massive issue.
Can you talk specifically about patience and why this is so vital, not just for ethical wildlife photography, but also for getting the best shots?
So this is clearly from the interview with Susie, which I listened to before. And Susie's a friend, and I completely agree with what she said about patience. The interesting thing is my photography career is very, very different from Susie's. So for me, patience is not quite as big a factor as you would think, though I would add another word to that mix and say that acceptance is equally important. So if you are someone who, like Susie, spends a lot of time trying to get special shots that other people might wish to take very quickly by taking shortcuts, such as approaching animals in ways that might not be appropriate, I don't actually spend much time photographing wildlife in that way. My work tends to be more along in the direction of photojournalism. So for me, acceptance of you will get some things and you won't get other things has probably been more important than patience. Learning to not feel disappointment because you don't get as close as you want or you don't see what you want, and letting that go and enjoying the experience for what it is, making the most of the photographic opportunity without overstepping any bounds. But of course, for in many other cases, patience is very important. The willingness to spend however long you need to in order to get a shot, or, like I said, to let it go.
And while we know best practices can vary depending on the species, situation, and even the person, as you just pointed out, what are some practical do's and don'ts that you can share for getting the best shots ethically?
It does really depend on the situation, as you say. In my case, because I work in Africa most of the time, I almost exclusively work with guides, and I follow their instructions. If it's not a guide, it might be somebody working with an NGO, it might be a researcher, it might be someone else who works professionally with conservation. I have a lot of experience myself, and I do often tend to think that I am able to read behavior of animals to some extent, but even so, if I am with a more qualified person, I do listen to them, and I would advise everyone else to do the same. And that's not only because they tend to know better and be more experienced, but again, this is connected to other things, to jobs and to tourism, and to ignore what a professional guide is telling you is also to place their job in danger in some cases. And then I would come back to what I said earlier about being kind. I really do think that kindness is underappreciated in life, but when it comes to being around wild animals, to show consideration, to really try to imagine the roles being reversed, and to not cause discomfort or distress in any way if you can help it. It is inevitable. We all make mistakes. Everyone does. There are going to be times when you think that you are behaving in a perfectly acceptable way and you'll still startle an animal, and it's okay. It happens, but we can do our very, very best to be conscious of it.
So what is an image or some images that you're adding to the Prints for Wildlife sale starting on August 28th? And is there a story that goes along with them?
To begin with, I have an image of a pair of Grauer's gorillas from Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are the world's largest primates. They are slightly larger than mountain gorillas, which are their closest cousins otherwise. I took this image back in 2014 working with a nonprofit organization called Gorilla Doctors. And this is actually quite a unique situation. So normally, when it comes to veterinary care, in most protected areas, we tend to draw a line between whether injury or damage to animals was caused by people or not. If it's caused by people, for example, if an animal gets caught in a snare, then we help. Whereas if an animal breaks a leg through natural means, then we don't. But because eastern gorillas, so both mountain gorillas and eastern lowland gorillas or Grauer's gorillas are so rare, an exception has been made. And so Gorilla Doctors, they monitor wild gorilla populations in the field, and they will intervene regardless of whether the injury was caused by people or by natural means. And so I spent about a month and a half following their work in the field in several different countries.
And do you have any additional photos or anything else that you're working on that you want to share?
So as I said, I'm currently in Tsvalu in northern South Africa. As soon as I'm done here, I will spend several weeks working with a few different anti-poaching organizations, so focusing primarily on following rangers around and documenting their everyday lives in the field in South Africa and in Namibia.
Marcus, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you're interested in purchasing one of the prints for wildlife, head to printsforwildlife.org. Again, their most recent campaign will run from August 28th through September 25th. You can find them on Instagram at printsforwildlife. Don't forget to also check out Marcus's work on his website, marcuswestberg.photo. You can find him on Instagram where his handle is at Marcus Westberg Photography. As always, if you enjoy the Monagabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. It truly is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing, but another way to help us is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Monagabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, so just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Monagabay to learn more and support the Monagabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Monagabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Monagabay newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Monagabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at monagabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Monagabay or on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where our handle is at Monagabay on all three platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Monagabay newscast. I am your interim host, Mike DiGirolamo, filling in for your regular host, Mike Gaurecki. I'll see you next time.